What happens when a late-night host known for satire pushes the wrong guest too far? What if a seemingly civil interview spirals into national chaos on live television? Tonight, we unravel the night CharlieKirk walked into Stephen Colbert's studio and walked out a national headline. The Ed Sullivan Theater was humming with its usual pre-show buzz. Crew members checked camera angles, producers ran through last-minute cue cards, and the audience filled in, ready for laughter, monologues, and a few politically charged zingers. Stephen Colbert, charismatic and sharp, paced backstage with practiced calm. Tonight's guest, CharlieKirk, conservative firebrand and founder of Turning Point USA. Colbert's smirk was already loaded. The goal wasn't just entertainment, it was confrontation disguised as conversation. Cameras rolled. The band hit its riff. Stephen walked out to roaring applause. What no one knew was that the tension brewing backstage had already frayed the edges of civility. CharlieKirk entered stage left to polite applause, flanked by a producer trying to mask nerves behind a clipboard. He adjusted his blazer, gave a tight-lipped nod, and shook Colbert's hand. The chemistry was ice from the start. Charlie's presence was stiff. Colbert's grin was sharp. The applause faded. They sat. The lights dimmed to interview mode. The show had barely begun, but an invisible line was already drawn. As Stephen eased into the introduction, his tone carried that signature edge, the kind that plays well to coastal audiences but cuts deep for guests who don't share the ideology. Charlie knew it, and so did Colbert. What the audience was about to witness wasn't a debate. It was a slow-motion collision course between two cultural titans on opposite ends of a national fault line. The first few questions were light, almost rehearsed. Colbert quipping about Turning Point USA's rise and Charlie volleying back with firm but polite responses. But it didn't take long before the tone shifted. "So, Charlie," Stephen said, cocking an eyebrow, "when exactly did basic education become woke indoctrination in your eyes?" The audience chuckled, sensing a jab, and Charlie blinked. He wasn't surprised, but he was already measuring his response. "When school stopped teaching critical thinking and started pushing critical race theory," he said, voice calm but charged. The applause was scattered. A few groans, the temperature had changed. Colbert leaned in, seizing the opportunity. "Do you think kids learning about historical inequality is dangerous? Or is it just inconvenient for your narrative?" The crowd whooped. Charlie exhaled slowly. "I think turning every child into an activist before they can grasp math and science is a problem. We're raising ideological foot soldiers instead of thinkers." His voice cut through the studio noise like a scalpel. Some in the audience applauded. Others crossed their arms. The tension was no longer simmering. It was simmering with intent. A staffer behind the camera exchanged a look with the producer. This wasn't going to be a smooth ride. Stephen's smile widened, but his eyes didn't. "Is that really it, Charlie? Or is it just that you don't like progress when it makes you uncomfortable?" That was the spark. Charlie's body straightened, his expression shifting from measured to unflinching. "What makes me uncomfortable," he said slowly, "is the idea that disagreement equals hate, or that questioning dogma makes me dangerous. That's not progress. That's cultural tyranny in a nice suit." The audience erupted. Cheers, boos, stunned silence. Colbert blinked, briefly thrown. He recovered, but the air had already changed. The gloves were coming off. From the wings, producers whispered into headsets, adjusting camera angles to catch every twitch, every glare. Colbert straightened his cue cards but didn't glance at them. He no longer needed prompts. "Charlie, isn't it true that what you call indoctrination is really just inclusion? Don't you think marginalized people finally getting a voice is a step forward?" The audience cheered reflexively. Charlie didn't flinch. "Inclusion doesn't mean erasing biology or rewriting history. It doesn't mean putting ideology before evidence." His voice rang out firm, resolute. Even some who disagreed sat up straighter. The exchange wasn't just charged, it was beginning to glow white-hot. Colbert scoffed softly, leaning back in his chair like he'd just heard a child recite a conspiracy theory. "You really think you're the voice of reason here?" he asked, gesturing to the crowd as if to say, "Can you believe this guy?" Charlie didn't blink. "I think reason doesn't depend on popularity. And frankly, if the crowd only claps when you attack your guest, maybe it's not a conversation. It's a performance. The audience reaction was instant. Half laughter, half shocked inhale. A cameraman glanced at the director who silently mouthed, "Keep rolling." There was no cutting to commercial yet. This was the show now. The exchange had gone off script. The jokes were gone. What remained was a confrontation between two men who represented opposing Americas. Charlie adjusted his lapel mic. Stephen sat forward again, slower this time, no grin. "So, let me get this straight. You're saying the entire educational system is corrupt?" Charlie shook his head. "I'm saying it's compromised, and people like you pretending otherwise are why it keeps happening." The words hit like bricks. Colbert blinked, momentarily stunned. In the audience, someone muttered, "Wow," audible on mic. The silence that followed was louder than any punchline. Backstage, a junior producer whispered into a headset, "Should we prep a cut?" The response came quick, "No, not yet." The control room smelled blood. On stage, Colbert crossed one leg over the other, masking irritation with curiosity. "So who decides what's compromised, Charlie? You? Your donors? Your newsletter subscribers?" A laugh line, sure, but it didn't land clean. Charlie tilted his head, eyes locked in. "It's not about who decides. It's about who notices. Parents notice. Students notice. And no amount of late-night mockery makes that concern less real." The crowd stirred. Not applause, not laughter. Just shifting weight, uncomfortable awareness that the crack had begun to show. Stephen leaned forward, changing tack. "You claim to care about students, yet you demonize teachers and librarians? Isn't that a little hypocritical?" His voice had cooled. Fewer jokes now, more courtroom precision. Charlie countered instantly. What's hypocritical is calling it education when kids are being taught to hate their own country before they've read the Constitution. That's not schooling, that's sabotage. Colbert's eyes narrowed. He sensed he'd lost some of the studio. That wasn't supposed to happen. The tension began seeping into the crew, the band, the audience. A boom operator subtly repositioned. A floor manager mouthed, "Hold your cue." Something was unraveling, something deeper than just the segment. Charlie took the silence as permission. "This whole setup," he said, gesturing to the lights, the cameras, the cheering on cue, "this isn't dialogue, it's theater. And you're not interested in understanding, you're interested in humiliating." For a beat, Colbert said nothing. Then came the words that would change the course of the evening. "If you can't handle disagreement, Charlie, maybe you shouldn't be on the stage." The tone wasn't playful anymore. It was a challenge, the kind that turns from debate to duel. And CharlieKirk wasn't backing down. The atmosphere shifted from tense to volatile. The audience was no longer a monolith. They were divided, some nodding at Charlie's boldness, others glaring in disapproval. Colbert adjusted his tie, eyes flickering toward the teleprompter, then back to his guest. "This isn't a debate stage, Charlie. It's a comedy show. Maybe that's why you're confused." A few chuckles broke the silence, but even that laughter felt forced. Charlie leaned forward, hands folded tightly. "Confused? No, Stephen, I'm crystal clear. You're hiding behind jokes to push ideology. You ridicule the people you don't understand, and when they show up to defend themselves, you cut their mic or shame them." The audience gasped slightly at the accusation. Colbert scoffed but didn't interrupt. Charlie pressed on. "You think this is clever? That you can insult half the country and then laugh it off because you do it with a wink?" He shook his head. "That's not satire. That's cowardice with a punchline." The control room lit up with whispers. "This is off the rails," one producer muttered, "but ratings are going to explode." Another responded, "We let it roll." Meanwhile, Stephen's expression had gone from playful to stone. He wasn't laughing, he was recalculating. Colbert finally responded, his voice lower, more deliberate. "You came here to stir outrage, didn't you? That's your currency, rage, fear, division." He let the words linger. Charlie stared at him. "No," he said. "I came here thinking maybe you'd be honest for once. Maybe you'd step out from behind the desk and actually talk like a man, not a brand." The words sliced clean. There was no applause, no music, just stillness. The kind that precedes either a resolution or a rupture. And everyone in the room knew which direction this was heading. Backstage, Colbert's longtime assistant, Jules, watched the monitor with arms crossed. She'd seen tense interviews before, but nothing like this. "He's not just poking Charlie," she murmured to the producer beside her. "He's poking a movement." The producer nodded, sweat forming at his brow. On stage, the energy was turning combative. CharlieKirk leaned back slightly, letting a smirk creep into his face. "You think this is uncomfortable, Stephen? Imagine being a conservative college student right now. Imagine being told your values are dangerous just because they're not trendy." Colbert didn't smile. "Imagine being a black or gay student who's had to hide who they are for generations. Are you saying their experiences don't matter?" He shot back. The audience applauded, but it was delayed, not the instant validation the show was used to. Charlie's reply came cold and fast. "Their stories matter, but pain doesn't justify propaganda. You can uplift without indoctrinating." That word again, indoctrinating. Colbert shifted in his chair, subtly gripping the armrest. He was starting to realize this wasn't going to end in a clever joke and a closing cheer. The structure was breaking down. Camera 2 cut to a wide shot as Jules whispered into her mic, "We need to prep commercial." "He's not going to stop." The director hesitated. "Number not yet. This is nuclear." On stage, Charlie leaned in. "I'm here to say what millions are too scared to say aloud. You've built a stage on ridicule and called it virtue. And now that someone challenges it, you act like you're the victim." The studio lights felt hotter. The silence felt longer. A clash wasn't coming, it was already happening, and neither man was retreating. Colbert's grin had vanished completely. He adjusted his posture, now sitting forward with both hands clasped. "You keep using the word indoctrination, Charlie," he said slowly. "But isn't that just your buzzword for anything that doesn't conform to your ideology?" The audience stirred, unsure if this was rhetoric or an accusation. Charlie's eyes narrowed. "No, Stephen. Indoctrination is when dissent isn't allowed, when children are told what to think instead of how to think. And what you're doing here, this ambush, this smugness, it's a microcosm of the entire problem." The jab landed. Even Colbert's crew sensed it. A camera operator momentarily pulled focus. The laughter sign dropped but was ignored. A low murmur rolled through the room like distant thunder. "I invited you here to have a conversation," Colbert said, his voice flatter now. "And you came with a flamethrower." Charlie shrugged. I came with facts. You're the one playing arsonist. You light these ideological fires night after night, then blame people like me for noticing the smoke." The crowd reacted again, this time with a mix of gasps and applause. Lines had not just been crossed, they were being erased. From the booth, a voice crackled, "We either cut now or let them burn." The director held firm. Let it burn. On stage, Colbert paused, swallowing the tension. "You want to talk about control, Charlie?" he said, eyes sharp. "Then admit your movement thrives on fear. Fear of change, fear of equality, fear of losing power." Charlie leaned forward, eyes cold. "We're not afraid of change. We're afraid of lies. Wrapped in virtue, sold as justice. And you're the top salesman." The silence that followed wasn't stunned. It was expectant. Everyone in the room could feel it now. The explosion was no longer theoretical. It had arrived. The studio had never been so divided. One half of the audience leaned forward, visibly enthralled. The other sat back, arms crossed, lips tight. The applause light remained dark. No prompting could fix what was unraveling in real time. Colbert stared at Charlie, his voice more clipped than before. "You keep accusing people of lying, Charlie. But what are you doing here if not trying to control the narrative?" Charlie didn't hesitate. "Control? I'm here because millions of Americans feel voiceless on platforms like yours. Because when we speak, we're labeled racist, bigot, extremist, anything to dismiss instead of debate." Colbert's jaw tensed. "So this is you saving the Republic? A hostile takeover of a comedy show?" His tone was sarcastic, but it didn't hit. The humor had curdled. Charlie's face didn't move. No, Stephen. This is someone finally telling you to your face that moral superiority doesn't make you right, and ratings don't make you righteous. A soft, "Whoa," echoed from the back row. One woman in the audience looked down at her phone, already typing. Tweets were flying mid-show. Name's Charlie vs. Colbert was already trending, and the segment hadn't even ended. This wasn't just an interview, it was an ideological courtroom, and no one could look away. Backstage, a tech assistant muttered, "We need to get control back." But control was gone. Colbert shifted again, his next line tight with frustration. "You act like the victim, Charlie, but your movement has power, influence, money." Charlie nodded. "And still, we're shut out of rooms like this unless it's for spectacle. Unless it's to be laughed at. Well, not tonight." That final sentence landed like a gavel. The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay silent. The crew didn't know whether to cut to commercial or let it roll. And Colbert knew the moment had slipped from his grip. Stephen Colbert's voice dropped lower, but the edge in it was unmistakable. "You talk about being shut out, Charlie, but you're sitting here on one of the biggest shows in America. You're not censored. You're platformed." Charlie's reply was ice. "No, I'm displayed. There's a difference. You didn't invite me here to listen. You invited me to be dismantled, live, for clout. But you underestimated one thing: I don't play by your script." A ripple of gasps moved through the crowd. It was no longer a show, it was a standoff. And the studio could feel it in their bones. Colbert leaned back, his jaw set, trying to recover the rhythm. "Maybe you're right," he said with a cold smile. "Maybe I should have known you'd come here swinging. But I thought we were going to talk, not perform ideological theater." Charlie's laugh was short and bitter. "You've been doing ideological theater for years, Stephen. I'm just not willing to play the role of punching bag tonight." The audience reaction was mixed. Cheers clashed with boos. A stagehand flinched as a coffee cup tipped over near the band's riser. Even the drummer hesitated, uncertain if they'd be asked to cue a buffer beat or sit in the quiet. And then it came. The moment no one could walk back. Colbert narrowed his eyes. "If you think defending indoctrination is bravery, you're more deluded than I thought." The insult didn't land, it detonated. Charlie rose slightly from his seat, only an inch, but the movement froze the room. "You don't get to call me deluded," he said. "You built a career mocking beliefs you don't understand. But tonight, you finally ran into someone who won't sit here and smile while you do it." The tension had snapped. The mask of civility was gone, and the countdown to ejection had officially begun. A producer standing just off stage made the signal for a commercial cut, but the director refused to fade. "We're in the moment," he said flatly. "Let it burn." On stage, the air had thickened with something far heavier than disagreement. It was contempt. CharlieKirk sat back down, slow and deliberate. Colbert, arms folded now, didn't speak for a beat. When he finally did, his voice was clipped. "If this is what you think passes for civil discourse, no wonder your events end in protests." Charlie fired back instantly. "Better a protest than a puppet show. At least people show up to speak, not laugh on cue." The audience reacted like a bomb had gone off. Some gasped, others clapped, but a growing number remained still. Even the show's core fans didn't know how to respond. Colbert's expression shifted to something colder than anger. Control. "You came here with one goal, to make headlines," he said. "Congratulations, Charlie, you've done it. But that doesn't make you right." Charlie tilted his head. "And mocking half the country doesn't make you enlightened. It just makes you comfortable." The remark sucked the air out of the room. A cameraman blinked at the control booth. The producer mouthed again, "Cut?" Still no signal. Then Colbert did something rare. He looked directly into the camera instead of at his guest. "We'll be right back," he said flatly. But there was no music, no cue, no applause. Just a hard cut to black. Backstage, the control room erupted in chaos. Floor managers scrambled to rearrange the next segment. Assistants whispered in panic. But in the middle of it all, CharlieKirk sat motionless in his chair. Calm, resolved. The firestorm hadn't thrown him off. If anything, he was only getting started. And Stephen Colbert knew it. As the commercial break stretched longer than usual, backstage tension mounted. A makeup artist hovered near the wings, unsure whether to approach. A segment producer paced, headset askew, muttering, "We need to regain control." But on stage, control was a relic. When the cameras came back live, the studio was hushed. No band, no laughter, just silence as Colbert adjusted in his seat and forced a smile that barely held. "We're back," he said, eyes trained on Charlie. "Let's finish this conversation, if that's even possible." Charlie didn't wait. "Sure," he said. "Let's finish what you started. Let's talk about how you cloak ideological attacks in comedy, then hide behind the laugh track when called out." The audience stirred uneasily. No one cheered. No one laughed. The line between satire and hostility had been obliterated. Colbert's eyes narrowed. "You came here to provoke. I gave you a platform and you used it to smear educators, activists, people just trying to make this country better." Charlie's tone hardened. "No, I came here to expose how people like you silence anyone who disagrees by calling it hate. That's not justice. That's manipulation." In the control room, the director shook his head. "We've lost the show." But on stage, it was clearer than ever. This wasn't a segment gone wrong. It was a showdown that had been simmering long before the lights ever came on. Colbert stood abruptly. "I think we're done here," he said. Charlie didn't move. "You're right," he replied. "We are." And just like that, the spell was broken. Colbert gestured toward a producer. Security was already moving. Charlie stood on his own, no shouting, no chaos. Just a stare down that would echo far beyond the walls of that studio. The moment Charlie rose from his chair, the audience didn't erupt. They froze. There was no grand gesture, no raised voice, no overturned table, just a cold, calculated silence. Stephen Colbert gestured once more to the side of the stage, and two security staff in plain black suits began to move in. But Charlie held up a hand and said clearly, "No need." "I know the way out." His voice wasn't angry, it was surgical. And that made it land harder than any outburst ever could. Stephen stayed behind his desk, arms folded tightly. "When guests come onto this show and refuse to engage in good faith, we show them the door," he said. Not to Charlie, but to the crowd. But the audience didn't respond. There was no applause, no laughter, not even a murmur. Charlie turned to the crowd, locking eyes with no one and everyone. "This is what happens," he said, "when you say the unsayable, when truth becomes a threat." Then he walked, slowly without looking back toward the curtain. Security paused as he passed. They weren't needed. Backstage, the production crew stood still, watching monitors in silence. Some looked relieved. Others looked shaken. A stage manager exhaled hard. "That's going viral in 10 minutes, he muttered. Back in the studio, Colbert tried to reclaim the room. "We'll be right back with something a little lighter," he said, but his voice cracked ever so slightly. The band didn't play. No cue cards were shuffled. Just silence. The kind that can't be edited out. CharlieKirk was gone, but the damage was just beginning. The cameras cut to commercial again, but the control room didn't move. No one shouted, no one barked reset orders. They just stared at the monitors replaying Charlie's exit. Colbert sat at his desk, shoulders tense, flipping through cards that no longer mattered. One producer whispered, "We lost the crowd." Another replied, "No, we gave them something they didn't expect. Raw, unfiltered, dangerous." The buzz wasn't in the studio anymore. It was online. And it was spreading like fire. On social media, the clip hit Twitter within minutes. Hashtags like #Kirk versus Colbert, #Charlie walks, and #Studio Showdown trended simultaneously. Left-leaning accounts accused Charlie of hijacking the platform to push his agenda. Right-leaning voices hailed him as a warrior who stood firm in enemy territory. But the most viral posts weren't ideological. They were stunned. "I've never seen Colbert speechless before. That wasn't a talk show, that was a trial." The comments raged across all sides of the cultural aisle, but one thing was certain. Something about that segment broke the format. Meanwhile, CharlieKirk had already left the building. Outside, a crowd of photographers and fans had gathered, tipped off by a whisper from the audience. As he exited the stage door, questions were shouted. Did Colbert set you up? Do you regret going on the show? Charlie didn't stop. He simply looked ahead and said, You saw it. Make up your own mind. Then he stepped into a black SUV and disappeared into the city's electric night. But the story? It was just beginning to ignite. By morning, every major outlet had seized the clip. CNN called it a dangerous turn in televised discourse. Fox News labeled it a rare moment of truth on liberal turf. Even apolitical commentators weighed in. Op-eds flooded the digital space, some accusing Colbert of ambushing a guest, others slamming Charlie for bringing right-wing outrage to a left-wing stage. But the core of the conversation wasn't about politics. It was about control. Who owns the stage? Who defines the narrative? And what happens when someone breaks the unwritten rules? Stephen Colbert's team rushed into damage control. A statement was issued midday. The Late Show encourages spirited debate, but stands by its commitment to decency and respect. But it fell flat. Too vague for critics, too sanitized for fans. The next episode opened with Stephen making a carefully worded monologue about guests with agendas, but it was met with lukewarm applause. The fire had scorched more than the guest chair. It had singed Colbert's authority. He had built a brand on intellectual dominance, but for one night, that grip had slipped. Meanwhile, CharlieKirk went live on his podcast that afternoon. I didn't walk into that studio to be liked, he said. I walked in to speak what they don't want said, and they proved me right. The episode shattered previous listener records. Clips of his walkout were remixed, subtitled, and spread like wildfire. Memes, debates, reaction videos. All of it funneled into one conclusion. The culture war had just claimed another battleground, and the front lines were lit by studio lights. Back at CBS, internal emails flew across departments. Executives debated whether to address the fallout head-on or wait for it to pass. Some worried that Colbert had gone too far off script. Others insisted the show had simply caught lightning in a bottle. But one thing they agreed on, the internet had changed the rules. Late night wasn't safe anymore. Not when every guest could become a moment, every moment a movement. In private, Colbert reportedly told his team, I'm not apologizing for asking tough questions. But the tone was less conviction, more fatigue. In conservative circles, Charlie's appearance was already being canonized. Political commentators replayed his quotes over and over, calling it one of the most powerful takedowns of Hollywood hypocrisy ever televised. Memes flooded the internet. Charlie sitting across from Colbert's, edited with flames, spotlight beams, and battle music. But not everyone in his orbit celebrated. Some moderates warned that these theatrics, even when righteous, would deepen the polarization. Charlie disagreed. Truth isn't gentle, he said on his next appearance, and sometimes it has to walk out the front door to prove its point. Backstage, a new memo went out to Colbert's booking team. All future guests must undergo narrative alignment screening. Translation, no more wildcards, but it was too late. The moment had already broken containment. Viewers across the spectrum weren't just debating politics, they were questioning the talk show format itself. Was it entertainment? Journalism? A platform? A weapon? Whatever it had been before, it wasn't that anymore. Not after what CharlieKirk did. Not after Stephen Colbert let it air. Within 48 hours, the Charlie Colbert clash dominated cable news, YouTube breakdowns, and TikTok explainers. A leaked memo from CBS's PR team admitted what many suspected. The segment has created reputational volatility. Translation, viewers weren't just reacting, they were realigning. Ratings for Colbert's next show dipped slightly, but online engagement skyrocketed. Viewers tuned in not to laugh but to watch for cracks. Would he flinch? Would he address it again? Instead, Colbert made a cryptic joke. Well, I guess some guests leave a stronger impression than others. But CharlieKirk wasn't joking. His next campus appearance drew double the usual crowd. He stood at the podium, paused for effect, and said, Stephen Colbert wanted a villain. Instead, he got a mirror. The room exploded with applause. To his base, he hadn't just survived the ambush, he'd exposed it. Conservative influencers clipped the line within minutes. It spread through digital spaces faster than cable could catch up. Suddenly, Kirk wasn't just a guest, he was a symbol of defiance, of disruption, and of what happens when someone walks into the lion's den and doesn't get eaten. And still, the cultural divide deepened. Liberal commentators dismissed the moment as performance rage, while others feared the precedent it set. If every guest weaponizes their segment, we'll stop having guests altogether, one former showrunner warned. But it was already happening. Bookings were being reviewed. Publicists were retracting appearances. The air had changed. CharlieKirk didn't just walk off a show, he had rattled the foundations of how talk shows operate. And Stephen Colbert, whether he admitted it or not, knew that stage would never feel the same again. Inside other late-night green rooms, the message was loud and clear. Control your segments, or risk becoming the next Colbert. Hosts who once prided themselves on letting guests speak now asked for tighter pre-interview briefings. Producers whispered warnings to talent agents. No more wildcards. And publicists began declining invitations for guests who might, even remotely, ignite the kind of powder keg CharlieKirk had set off. One showrunner from a rival network summed it up bluntly. The age of surprise TV is over. Everyone's scared. Stephen Colbert, meanwhile, kept his head down. He didn't mention Charlie again, not directly, but subtle references bled into his monologues. Jokes about walking out mid-sentence, guests allergic to facts, or truth bombs with poor aim. The audience laughed, but the laughter had a new texture. Nervous, defensive, self-conscious. The edge had returned, but it wasn't sharpened by wit. It was dulled by damage. The show moved forward, but the shadow of that night lingered like smoke after a fire. Charlie, on the other hand, leaned into the moment. He rebranded that week's podcast The Colbert Collision and sold out his next 3 live events. Whether you loved him or loathed him, his profile had doubled. And in a media ecosystem fueled by disruption, that was victory. One viral segment, one walk-off, one battle of wills, and the entire late-night playbook had to be reconsidered. Charlie hadn't just hijacked the interview, he'd hijacked the format. And for an industry built on control, that was a deeper threat than anything he said on air. In the weeks that followed, a new kind of caution seeped into the world of televised conversation. Colbert's team tightened every segment down to the second. Guest lists were reviewed with surgical precision. Controversial figures were quietly uninvited. It wasn't censorship, they called it tone alignment. But everyone behind the scenes knew the real name: fear. CharlieKirk had shattered the illusion that these shows were in control, and now every producer in Hollywood was building walls to keep the next explosion from detonating live. Yet despite all efforts to bury the moment, it lived on. College debate teams studied it. YouTubers dissected it. Commentators from all sides referenced it as a turning point in the culture war's media front. Colbert remained silent on the deeper implications. But that silence said more than any monologue ever could. He hadn't lost just an interview. He had lost a piece of his stage's invincibility. A stage that once felt bulletproof had, for the first time in years, looked vulnerable. So, what do you think? Was CharlieKirk justified in walking off, or did Stephen Colbert just finally ask the question too directly? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit that subscribe button, and tell us who you want covered next. Because if there's one thing Hollywood keeps forgetting, it's that the real stories don't come from scripts. They come from the moments no one could control. And this was one of them.